My name is Mike Larsen, and I am the current president of the BC Freedom of Information and Privacy Association. I'm also the co-chair of the Department of Criminology at Carleton University. Purpose of this introduction here is to set up a video that you'll be seeing based on a conversation recently between myself and David Mackay. David Mackay is the Asper Visiting Professor in the School of Journalism at UBC in Writing and Media, as well as the Deputy Managing Editor of the National Observer. He's also a real veteran investigative journalist who's also been teaching journalism across the country. And one of the things that David is known for in terms of his FOI work is filing FOI requests for data, as opposed to traditional forms of records. Here we're talking about things like spreadsheets, databases, and the actual data that goes into these different resources. This is incredibly useful for someone working in the field of investigative journalism, but also for transparency advocates who are interested in getting access to information about trends and about the information that governments collect on both the population and on the work that they do. So in the conversation that follows, David and I talk a bit about the distinction between your traditional FOI requests and data-focused FOI requests. We talk about why filing access requests for data is so important and some of the challenges that arise and how to navigate them in this kind of process. We also get into some of the issues facing the FOI system in general in Canada and some recommendations for reform. I think it's a really interesting conversation. I certainly learned a lot as we were talking, and I do hope that you enjoy this. And if you are interested in this conversation and material along these lines, I really encourage you to get involved with BC FIPA. Thanks. FIPA acknowledges with respect the Indigenous peoples on whose traditional territory we conduct activities. While striving to increase privacy protection and access to information for everyone, we recognize that colonization and associated attitudes, policies, and institutions have significantly changed Indigenous peoples' relationship with this land. For many years, those same things served to exclude Indigenous peoples from the privacy protection and access to information afforded to others. FIPA is committed to redressing these historic and continued barriers. And we acknowledge the insight and knowledge of elders past, present, and emergent, and the relationship to this land and these issues. My name is Mike Larsen. I'm a professor of criminology at Carleton University and the president of the BC Freedom of Information and Privacy Association. And it's my great pleasure to be here today with David Mackay for our conversation about big data and FOI. Before getting any further into this, I just wanted to acknowledge that we're actually here physically together. It's the first in-person event I've done in years. Mm-hmm. We're here at the campus UBC Point Grey, which is on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam First Nation. I'm, as always, grateful to be on this land and to recognize the peoples who have been here and are here and will be here in the future. I'll take this opportunity to, just in terms of preliminaries before we get into the chat here, just to note that if anyone has any questions, and I certainly hope you do as we go through, you can post those questions in the chat, and we're going to have some time we've set aside towards the end of this for you to share, for us to respond to questions and perhaps invite you to pose them directly via microphone or camera too. And Jason, our executive director, is going to be in the chat curating and compiling a list of some really good questions as we go forward. We are recording the conversation portion of the event between myself and David, and we're going to be posting that online, making that available afterwards for anyone who wants to share it around, or if anyone couldn't make it here. We won't be recording the question and answer period, so we can all feel free to speak freely and off the cuff. Mm-hmm. And without further ado, the reason I'm here is to join Professor David Mackay, who is the Asper Visiting Professor of the School of Journalism, UBC, in Writing and Media, here in BC today, but often elsewhere in Canada. David also has a long storied career as an award-winning journalist at UBC, is the Deputy Managing Editor of the National Observer, and finds time also to teach at Carleton University, University of King's College in Halifax, and at Ryerson University as well. And so certainly someone who's done the circuit of journalism in Canada and has made a number of contributions to the literature on FOI as well. And it would be remiss of me not to plug the Your Right to Know text you've got here with Jim Bronskill, which is a fantastic starting point for getting into FOI. But without further ado, welcome, David.
It's good to be here.
Thank you for joining us. So we're here to talk about FOI and big data as part of that as well. And I thought it would be prudent for us to start by asking a bit about how you got, as a journalist, how you got into using freedom of information as part of your work.
Well, you know, journalism is a very competitive business, and you always want a leg up on the competitor, and that includes competitor fellow journalists within your own newsroom. But more to the point, you know, we wanted to, when we're in journalism school, we talk about wanting to make a difference, getting into this business because you want to change policy, you want to affect change. And I was lucky enough to be around some really good practitioners who said, look, there's this device called access to information, freedom of information, that allows you to gain access to government records, briefing notes, and data sets, which we'll get into later. And I just started asking for them. And it really started with, and this is something that I tell people not to do, start with a big project, but we started with the big project, and that is adverse drug reactions. And it started with a drug called Zyban, which was a smoking cessation drug that was causing a lot of harm to a lot of folks. And so we just asked a very simple question about the drug, wanted information, we couldn't get it. And to make a very long story short, we ended up asking for the entire adverse drug reaction database from Health Canada, which we eventually got. We did stories. And what was the amazing thing is that we put up a searchable version of this database online, and we were flooded with interest, with requests, people digging into it for information, and so much so that Health Canada ended up doing the very same thing the next year. So that showed us that there was a tremendous interest in this, and we were also able to tell stories that we wouldn't have been able to tell otherwise about the danger of certain classes of drugs, the dangers that those drugs pose for kids and for senior citizens and whatnot. And that's very empowering. And it's we felt, well, we could keep this going, right? We could keep this going. And all of a sudden we were armed with really pertinent questions that we could put to policymakers, and they had to answer them. And so that's basically how I got going. And to me, you know, I tell my students this, my appreciation of access to information, my appreciation of public records, my appreciation of data really revolutionized my career, but even more importantly, it led me down the road of being able to tell more important stories.
It's fascinating. So often people start off with access to information, getting into, you know, some of the more, I think, predictable or usual types of documents, right? Emails, briefing notes, these kinds of things. But you were going for the
data, but we didn't know what we didn't know. And it was a learning exercise, and it continues to be a learning exercise. But I would like to think that that was really one of the precursors of the open data movement, because now if you look on all kinds of websites, you'll see similar data sets that are now available.
Right, yeah. And so it's gone from this process of really having to extract data from kind of resistant organizations through a process everyone's discovering together, to something where now, I think more often than not, really useful data is actually available.
That's right, yeah.
I know many of the people joining us or perhaps watching this have filed access requests before, and I know in my experience most people are filing requests for, you know, documents traditionally understood. And those are still really important to file for. Actually, you can get a lot of really useful stuff there. But maybe you can give us a sense of what does one get? What can one get through filing requests for data sets? What is the opportunity that's afforded by going after a data set as opposed to you know, particular records here and there?
Well, I'll circle back to the you know, to the example of the adverse drug reactions, for example. So you can identify a certain class of drugs, right? So you know, for example, if we take a look at seniors, it turned out that what was happening and this really came to fruition recently, especially during the pandemic, is what nursing homes were doing was they were prescribing antipsychotic drugs, very powerful antipsychotic drugs to seniors to basically make them more docile. Because we are living in an age now where an increasing number of seniors in nursing homes have some form of dementia. And you've got these nursing homes that are understaffed, they're overworked, and really having to drug their residents is one of the only ways that they can cope, which is an awful indictment of our system. And we're seeing that come to fruition right now with all the coroner's inquest and all the questions about long-term care. So we were able to see the remnants of that right, in the actual data, in our analysis of the data, just by grouping and sorting and seeing how things behaved over time and whatnot. So we weren't able to identify the individuals because that was one of the concerns that Health Canada had. Well, if we give you this data, then you'll be able to find out who the individual is. And we're saying, well, if you've got hundreds of thousands of data points,
right,
we're not that good.
You know, triangulation.
We're not that good, right? Triangulation really does not work, right? So we were able to identify the kinds of trends that they didn't even know existed, right? And so I think that that's the advantage of data. You can you know, if I want to localize this, for example, and I want accident data, I can, as a journalist, if I get accident data, I can identify the most problematic areas of town, right, where you are more likely to you know, be part of a collision. Right. And if that's the case, then I, as a journalist, or a policy advocate or an advocate, can go to a local politician, a provincial politician, or maybe even a federal politician, and say, this is the case, right? This is the case. This is what's happening, and this is your own data. I'm not making this up. So that's the key with data. It's that it's your own data. Yeah. It's not, I'm not making this stuff up. I'm not bringing it from somewhere else. This is your own data set, and maybe you should be analyzing it this way. Yeah. So that's one of the advantages.
And I think it corresponds with the idea that governments, public bodies of all kinds, are so invested in collecting information.
That's right.
You know, so we're really responding to the idea that this is the way governance is done in the current context. And it's a useful way for us to learn about public bodies, but also, as you pointed out, I think very importantly, to hold them accountable for the work that they're doing. And it's publicly accessible, or should be publicly accessible data. Fascinating. And as we can see, so public health, we can see in terms of road safety, so many other areas where data is useful. That brings me to the idea of actually filing a data request. We both teach freedom of information process to students, and so part of that is composition, right? How do you effectively compose a request? If you're trying to give some advice to someone who's looking to compose their first data-focused FOI requests, what would you offer?
Well, the big thing, one of the things that we try to teach in journalism is not to use cliches, right? Not to use the names that government agencies use for different pieces of information, acronyms and whatnot. What I'm going to tell you is that turns that advice on its head. You have to know what a data set is called, right? You have to know as much information about it as possible. So at the federal level, there's something called InfoSource, which is essentially an inventory of records. So you can go onto InfoSource and you can see, okay, what is the data set? Is it administrative? If it's administrative, then you're probably not going to get anything because it has to do with human resources, right? But if it's for public policy purposes, then chances are you might be in business. And so you need to know what that data set is called. You're not going to really know a whole lot about, because data sets are absolutely huge, right? A data set can be a little spreadsheet with maybe, as little as maybe 100 records, or it could contain basically 100 million records, right? So if you StatCan, for example, their international trade data, which they release every month, you're talking about, and I've downloaded the entire data set, you're talking about 110 million rows of information. So, you need to know how large it is. So this is what I tell people to do. Find out what it's called and just pay your $5 at the federal level and say, I want access to an extract of this data set. And I say extract because you're not going to get the whole thing. There's personal information in there that you're just not going to get. So you want an extract, but before anything happens, before you send it out to the primary office of interest, I want to have a conversation with the keeper of the data so that we can negotiate, And one of the first things that you want to ask for is what's called a data dictionary or a record layout. So you see the lay of the land, essentially. So is it one table with a bunch of columns and rows, or is it what's called a relational database where you have a number of tables that are linked through common denominators? And then once you can kind of figure that out, then you can say, okay, well, I want this, I want this, I want this. I'm not going to get the personal information. I'm not going to get any geographic information that will identify where a person is. So if it's crime data, for example, you know, the police will basically tell you the area, right? The general area where the crime happened, but they won't give you the address for obvious reasons. So you're not going to get that. And then it's just a question of back and forth, negotiation, which we did with Health Canada, by the way, and which I still do almost every week. And eventually you're going to get something. Now, here's the thing. You might not then have to continue on with the formal request and pay more money because you've agreed what you're going to get. And the really positive thing about releasing data is that it's really easy, right? All they basically have to do is to press a few buttons and they can give you the extract. Don't let them tell you that it's complicated. Don't let them tell you that it's going to take up all kinds of CPU time and all that kind of stuff. Don't let them snow you, right? It's a fairly straightforward process that can give you really, really good results. And so what you're going to get is a smaller data set that will allow you to that will allow you to kind of figure things out, like, is something getting worse? Is it getting better? What areas is it getting better in? And you can identify trends that, again, as a journalist, as a policymaker, as an advocate, as an interesting citizen, we all have a right to this information, then you're off to the races.
So much useful advice in there. Something else that I often recommend to people when they're starting to compose requests is to take a look at what's already been released by other people. So if I go into the federal open data portal or the open information portal and I go into previous ATIP requests, I can find data requests. Would you find that helpful in terms of learning the ropes the first time, looking for someone else who's filed for something similar and changing a few words and proceeding?
Absolutely. So that's an excellent suggestion. So one of the things that I do is I go to the one of the open data portals is for previously released requests, and you can use a search term, data or database or download, right? And you can see what's been released. And if there are requests where the entire database has been released or there's been a partial release, then chances are it's pretty. So I would ask for that. And then once you get it within about a month or so, then you can take a look at it. And then if it looks pretty good, then just update it. Just update it. Use the same wording and just update it and you're in business.
Absolutely.
Okay. But even when there is a goose egg where it says 0 records released, that doesn't mean to say that there's nothing there. It could be that the request was abandoned. It could be that the wording was imprecise. It could be that the time reference was too narrow or too wide. Could mean all kinds of things. So what you want to do is you want to get on the phone, talk to the official who handled that request, and find out. And part of the open data movement and part of access to information is that we have a right to do that. We don't have to always then pay our $5. We have a right to ask for this information through the informal process. Because as you know, that informal process is an integral part of access to information at the federal level and freedom of information at the provincial and municipal level.
Yeah, and it goes to the incredible value of having that kind of conversation back and forth. You wrote a chapter for my book with Kevin Walby. The book's called Brokering Access, and that's the whole ethos of the book is pick up the phone and have that initial conversation and build a bit of rapport. It may take time, but I think the results are usually better in the end for having done that. I want to circle back to InfoSource. It's just in terms of people who've never used some of these resources before, just typing in a search for InfoSource should get you the entire thing. It's a really useful resource. it covers all federal public bodies that are subject to the Access to Information Act. But to the best of my knowledge, there's no provincial analog. We've been calling for, these kinds of things at the provincial level for a long time. So if someone's looking to file an FOI request in Ontario or Manitoba or in BC here, and they can't go to that resource, what advice would you offer for them? I would
ask them, I would advise them to see if they can get some sort of inventory of records. Now, you're right. It's very tough. Some provinces like Ontario are starting to get a little bit better, but they're just not there yet. So you have to do like a 2-step process or maybe a 3-step process where you can actually ask at the provincial level for previously released requests. Right? And they will go through because it's in their database, right? I always circle back to data. They keep track of all of this stuff. So they can just basically go into their database and they can just output a list of records that have been released. You'll have to pay your $5 for it, but from that, you can then cherry pick. And this is what we've done in Ontario, for example. I've started to do that. We did that as part of some investigations, and we've got some interesting briefing notes and house card notes, as they call them, and so on. So that's the way to do it. But you're right. That is one of the reforms that has to happen at the provincial level. But barring that, and I circle back to what I wrote in the chapter, that it's incumbent on us to do as much homework as possible, because that's the way we're going to extract the most information out of these systems as possible, is if we do our homework. But governments don't make it very easy. They really don't. So the promise of open data, of open government is there. It's in policy, not law, it's a policy, but they just don't make it very easy. It's a very opaque system.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. So we've covered off some of the process of filing a request for data and some of the, I think, the really important ideas about preliminary work and homework on that. In terms of the actual records themselves, I remember back when people first started filing for data-based requests, it was common for people to get, the PDF printout of Excel sheets. And then sometimes they would actually say, well, we're going to charge an additional fee in terms of production, in terms of research. We're going to index that to the number of pages, which is ridiculous for a database. I think we've gotten a bit better with that now. When you're asking for data, you're getting something usable. But what would I really want to make sure I did to ensure that I'm not just getting 400 pages of PDF documents, I'm actually getting a usable data set?
So the key term is machine readable, that you want the data in machine readable format, for example, Excel or a spreadsheet. Because Mike, you're right. It's getting better, but it still happens. And I would say that it happens more at the provincial and municipal level than it does at the federal level. Federally, they are used to these kinds of requests now because they have a lot of media outlets like the CBC where I worked, like the Canada's National Observer where I work now. The Globe and Mail is really big into this, for example. The CBC is still doing it. And you've got a lot of startups now, who are really going big after data. So this is a thing that the federal system is really aware of. The provinces and the municipalities, they still have to come on board. The key is ask for machine readable format in Excel, for example, and that is a signal to them that you do not want a PDF. And I will also say, and I do not want a PDF. And you can write that in caps if you want, with an exclamation point or 2 exclamation points. But yeah, it's pretty good now. I must say that it's at the federal level. I'm running into that less and less, but I can't stress enough at the provincial and municipal level, you've got a ways to go. So make that very clear.
And probably a reflection of experience too, with the smaller shops that don't handle this kind of request. But there's such useful data at the provincial level.
Oh, it's fantastic.
At the municipal level, and even at the level of an institution like a university. I mean, these are data-based institutions as well, and fantastic reporting on, or other kind of work on these institutions can be done through data requests. And so, do we find that coordinators are the access coordinators that you deal with are comfortable? Are they familiar with database requests now more so? Are they good at responding to this, or do you still find that there's pushback in terms of, well, there could be privacy implications, there could be other implications, this is too much work?
There is pushback. One of the complaints that I get and it's not as frequently as it used to be, but is, well, if I provide you with this column of information or this data set, then you can somehow magically make stuff reappear. Right? That, we will try to delete a column or hide a column. Well, you shouldn't, they shouldn't hide a column. They should delete it, first of all, right? If they hide a column, I can unhide it, and anyone can do that. And so that's not on me, that's on them. But they will still adhere to this argument that somehow if they give you data in machine readable format, that you will magically be able to make stuff reappear. Okay? That argument is hogwash. Okay? Don't buy it, complain, push back, do whatever you have to do, right? It just does not work. But I would say that for the most part, it is getting better, because I don't want people to come away from this thinking, well, this is too hard. I wash my hands of the entire process. It does work. And the whole advent of open data, which is equated to open government, right? Open data equals open government, means that a lot of data sets are now available. I'll give you a perfect example. There was Corrections Canada is probably one of the most robust keepers of data for obvious reasons. You're dealing with federal inmates, and they keep information on an inmate's ethnicity, race, age, gender, you name it. Okay, what generally, what they're, like if they what the crime was, like all that kind of stuff. There was a time when you couldn't get that information. Now that information is available on their open data portal. It may not be as up to date as you would like, but one of the things that you can do now with the advent of open data is you can ask for updated data sets. And if they have it, then you can get it. But now you can do stories about some of the ways in which the over incarceration of Indigenous inmates or Black inmates, for example, is putting pressure on the system and creating unfairness. And the Globe and Mail, to its credit, Tom Cordoso did a story about this, and that story did very well from a public policy point of view, from a journalism point of view. And the reason that he was able to do that kind of story is because this information is now available. So that is the really good news. Like, there's a lot of good news here. And there's all kinds of data sets. So all you have to do is, if you want to tap into the federal data set, just type open data federal government or open data federal. Right? And that'll take you to the open data portal, open data BC, open data Alberta, and it'll take you to those open data portals. And then they have really good inventories of all of the data sets, and they add to those inventories regularly, some every week, some every month, some a few a year, right? But they are all adding to their inventories, and the data is getting better and better and better.
Absolutely. And I guess it's also worth noting that, I think most of what you've learned doing this, it's all been, as is often the case with people who do FOI work, it's learning by doing, it's all trial and error. But now, folks like yourself are actually teaching people how to do this. And there's others out there who have resources that can be really useful for us. And we were earlier talking about librarians, right? People who have expertise in geographic information systems and data sets. These can be really valuable resources if you're looking for particular forms of data, but haven't been able to navigate it yourself. Reaching out to other people in the field, I think, is a
Yeah, and I can't stress that enough. I mean, I teach a data journalism course at Carleton, for example, and I teach an investigative course at Carleton as well. And I've actually folded the geographic information system specialists into my course. They actually help me teach. They develop curriculum and so on, because what the librarians are able to do, the geographic information specialists are able to do, is they can negotiate with the institutions for more detailed data, right? That we as journalists or we as more regular users might not be able to do. And so, for example, collision data in Ottawa, right? If you go onto Ottawa's open data portal, you will get collision data that's pretty good, right? It'll tell you the intersection, it'll tell you the time of day, it'll tell you the severity of the injury, the severity of the crash. But what it won't tell you is whether there was a bicycle involved. It won't tell you whether there was a pedestrian involved. That information is available, but the library was able to get that information in more detailed data sets. And the only reason that I knew that it was available is because they had been working with me as part of our curriculum, and they had this information. So what I would say is that if there's a local library, or if you're at a university or a college, check with your librarian, because they deal with data sets all the time. This is census information now. We will be having a number of data sets that will be rolled out over the coming months. And that stuff will be on the open data portal. Not terribly easy to navigate, but the librarians can really help you.
Yeah, good advice. Absolutely. In terms of actually working with the data, we should talk about, we've kind of worked our way through the process of composing and filing. So here we are at the level where you've actually obtained the records.
Okay.
What kind of skill sets do we need to have to really work with that information effectively?
The good news is that very few. And you don't need any math. This is what I tell my students, and this is the point that we made in the Data Journalist, the one of the textbooks that we use, is that you can do this without doing basically any math. You sort, you filter, and you group, right? And you sort from largest to smallest, smallest to largest. You can group in categories. You can do all kinds of things just in Excel. And basically, you're looking for patterns. Is something getting better? Is it getting worse? And then you can subdivide things by subsets, right? So is a subset, and then you can compare subsets, right? So is one subset performing worse than another? For example, if I use restaurant inspections, okay, or food safety inspections. So in Ottawa, you have groups of establishments. So you have restaurants, you have daycare centers, you would have like like pools and public facilities, right? So what you can do is you can group those, and you can see which ones were inspected the most during certain time periods, right? You don't really need any math to do any of that stuff. That's the really cool part about this, is that but you do have to have some knowledge of Excel. Right? You need to be able to download a what's called a CSV file, comma separated value file, or if it's in Excel, it's got the XLSX extension. Download that and open it up. You have to make sure that you have Excel on your system, but you can open it up in Google Sheets as well, right? And lots of people have Google accounts. They can open it up and just do filtering and sorting. Here's the good news, guys. Google, you can Google anything. Right? You can Google YouTube. They have all kinds of really good instructional videos, right? That can get you up and running probably in about 10, 15 minutes. And I'm not exaggerating. It really is that easy. So there's a bit of a learning curve, but it's essentially sorting and filtering and grouping. And then you can kind of go from there.
Fantastic. It strikes me as well that this is a really interesting time for us to be having this conversation, just in terms of what's happening with FOI and ATI in Canada. We're seeing, the emergence of, not really the emergence, but the continuation of data-based requests as a major sector of requests. But we're also seeing reviews of the Access to Information Act at the federal level. We have a special legislative committee looking at the FIPA at the provincial level in BC. So there is a conversation about change, right? And change perhaps for the better in terms of where these laws need to go. If I was to put you on the spot and ask, what do you think we need to see done to our access to information laws in Canada to make the kind of work that you're doing and you're teaching about more accessible, easier for people to get into?
I think they've got to open them up. You have to understand that bureaucracies are built to be defensive. They're built to withhold information. They're not built to share information, right? Bureaucrats don't move up the hierarchy for liberating information, right? And they can get in trouble for liberating too much information. They move up the hierarchy, and they are rewarded, right, by keeping information secret. So it is very counterintuitive for any public institution to liberate that information, because you feel that you're just doing something wrong. And so I think that what they have to do is they've got to make information freely available. And I think that what we've seen is, with the horrific Russian invasion of Ukraine, for example, where we've seen basically massacres happening. And thank goodness that we've had news outlets that have been able to record this, credible news outlets that have been able to record this, whereas you have the Russians saying, well, this is fake news, disinformation. I think that during COVID, we've seen that more information is better than less information.
Sure.
We needed to know what neighborhoods were infected. We needed to know what ethnic groups were more adversely affected. We needed to know where the vaccination rates were better, where they were worse, so that we could send workers there.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. We saw, for example, during the recent so-called Freedom Convoy, that we needed information about where the money was going. We are in an age where we need information. We need to liberate information. And I would say that it's now, the time is over for governments to be withholding information. And I think that as citizens, we have to be demanding this. We have to be politicizing this. We have to be making demands to our local politicians, to our city councilors, to our town councilors, to our provincial politicians, territorial and federal politicians. Get it on the political agenda. There's there's an election coming up in Ontario, for example. Won't be one coming up federally for a few years because of the Liberal NDP accord that they've been able to strike. But make this part, politicize this, demand it, right? But I think that we've been through a number of crises now where we've seen that the access to information is crucial for us to be able to make decisions as citizens and for us to be able to make choices.
Yeah, yeah, and timely decisions and to not be infantilized in making those. So the data set is not a liability for public bodies. It's public information, and it's valuable for people actually to be able to see and work with. You pointed out Correctional Service of Canada had made data sets available that weren't previously available. I know there was a conversation about that, will this be detrimental to the organization? Will this be problematic for them? But it really isn't, right? I mean, this idea that having a more robust approach to transparency will somehow damage the institutional reputation doesn't really bear out. It's the secrecy that's the
and I don't want to minimize that, because there's a reason that federally the acronym is ATIP, access to information and privacy, right? Privacy is a big piece of it, and the Privacy Office is very busy. They're conducting all kinds of investigations on privacy breaches, very serious privacy breaches. So I don't want to minimize that. And StatCan, for example, whenever it's seen to be going too far, it is pilloried in the press about that, right? And it's negative headlines, and all of a sudden they've got to pull back. So I'm not suggesting that privacy concerns are to be minimized, that they are to be trivialized. I'm not suggesting that at all. But I think that we can strike the balance. Right? We can strike the balance, and there's some very smart people who are kind of figuring this stuff out, but we just have to do more to liberate information. But protection of privacy, your privacy, my privacy, our email address, all that kind of stuff, that has to be protected. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about being able to take a look at large tracts of data to allow us to make decisions, right? For example, where to put our loved one in a nursing home, right? If you're looking for a particular nursing home and you want to know if it has been inspected or how many times it's been inspected or what kinds of violations, you should be able to find that out fairly easily, right? If you want to find out, for example, where you're driving around, the economy is opening up now and you're driving around, where are you most likely to get a parking ticket? Where should you avoid? Not that you want to circumvent any bylaws, right? But you want to be more careful.
Yeah.
You want to make sure that, I better make sure that I put more money in the meter because I'm going to get ticketed, right? So we're talking about being able to make choices, or what restaurant that you want to eat at. Again, as the economy is opening up, as we are hopefully moving into an endemic stage of the pandemic, it's information. Information is power. It allows us to make it allows us to make decisions in our personal choices, and it allows us to then have information to make policymakers, lawmakers more accountable.
I like the trajectory you've talked about there, from access to information to open information to information liberation.
Yes.
Right? It's got a political focus to it, and I couldn't agree more that there's a real call for advocacy around this. I think too often governments have clear understanding of how useful this information is. They wouldn't be collecting it and using it so much if they didn't. But they can often rely on the fact that it's going to be lower on the list of public priorities. And yet, for almost every public policy issue that we're interested in, having more access to data sets, having more access to information would allow us to advance those particular objectives too, around health, around safety issues, criminal issues.
You know, what's really interesting is that, if you read, and I'm sure that you've read many briefing notes, right? So in a briefing notes are prepared for everything, right? And briefing notes are basically cheat notes for ministers, right? So there's a particular issue that comes up, and the bureaucrats prepare what are called briefing notes so that the minister is not caught unawares, right? And in the briefing, there is a calculation, right? And in the briefing note, there is usually a line that says, this issue is not expected to generate much publicity. In other words, don't really worry about it. We don't have to get into too much detail in this briefing note. And I would say that any information having to do with data, the release of data, the reform to freedom of information laws or whatever, that probably falls in that category. Yeah, we're going to prepare some briefing notes, but don't worry about it too much, right? We want to change that line. We want to change that line to, there's going to be an outcry to this. So we're going to prepare a briefing note for you that is going to prepare you to be answering some very tough questions, right? We want to change that line. And right now that line is that kind of reassurance that, well, we don't have to worry about it because the public is not going to really care too much about this stuff.
I think it's a good note to end the back and forth for us on here. And to start opening things up to everyone who's joined us today. I think we have some time to answer some questions, but I want to beforehand thank you so much for sharing your insights on this. Really valuable information.
You're quite welcome. This is important. So get to it, guys.
Thanks.
So there we go. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I enjoyed participating in it. It was actually the first in-person event that we've had with FIPA in quite some time, first kind of coming out of the pandemic event. So it was great to actually be there in person and chat with David and listen to some of the things he had to say about big data, FOI, some of the really practical tips that he's offering there, as well as some of the big picture issues about how this really reflects some trends in transparency in general. If you enjoyed this kind of event and you're interested in topics along these lines and similar kinds of events, I really encourage you to get involved with BC Freedom of Information and Privacy Association. We're not a massive organization, which means that we're a pretty agile one. We can offer events on a whole wide range of topics, and we always try to make these events focused on things that are of interest to people who are involved in the transparency as well as the privacy communities, trying to hit on some topical issues that will really add something to our shared understanding of these topics. I encourage you to become a member of BC FIPA and to help us to do this work and to help direct the organization, especially as we encounter new and emerging issues. And I also really encourage you to help us by donating to FIPA, preferably on an ongoing basis, which is something that's possible via our website, because it's those donations that really make it possible for FIPA to engage in public education activities, in research activities, as well as a lot of the advocacy work that really is core to our identity. And if you are interested in questions around transparency, big data, digital democracy, and privacy issues, well, I think FIPA is exactly the kind of organization that you should be a part of. So I want to thank you again, and I hope to see you next time. Cheers. The BC Freedom of Information and Privacy Association is an organization whose mission is to improve and defend privacy and transparency as vital components of a free and democratic society. We envision public agencies who are transparent in action and decision, people in control of their privacy and personal information, and privacy and transparency embedded in law and policy. We're one of Canada's few advocacy groups dedicated to access to information and transparency and privacy issues. We conduct research into the public opinion, policy and law that intersect access to information and privacy frameworks in BC and across Canada. And this includes monitoring the performance of public bodies, governments, and regulators in the sector. FIPA commissions studies and provides material that empower lawyers, journalists, students, and the public. In turn, we are frequently consulted on policy issues by politicians and government officials. FIPA's work encompasses legal research, public legal education, public assistance and aid, and law reform that focuses on transparency and privacy issues. If you're interested in these issues and you'd like to learn more, or if you'd like to contribute to FIPA as a donor or become a member of the BC Freedom of Information and Privacy Association, I encourage you to visit our website at fipa.bc.ca. You'll also find us on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube. Thanks very much.